Good afternoon, members of the City Council. My name is Christopher Peel. I live in an encampment in Nicholsville. I am here in support of Council Bill 118310 and the redlining study amendment. We would, because there's literally thousands of people in Seattle will benefit from more encampments. We would like to thank Mayor Murray for leading this effort, Councilperson O'Brien for introducing this bill, Councilwoman Schwant for important amendments, and all who voted for it. It's very important, and here's why I believe that's why. 16 people have died this year on the streets without shelter. Encampments are safer, they are more cost effective, and we're talking about helping 300 human beings basically get better access to services, to be put in a situation where it is easier for them to improve their situation, their lives, to get jobs and re-enter the functioning members and willingness of society. It's stable, it's better than being alone. Redlining is very bad. It's important that people be allowed to live everywhere that people should be allowed to live. That's not necessarily individually industrial districts. I would also like to thank you guys for scheduling this on a day when we're talking about international trade, because international trade and American jobs are tied to this issue of homelessness and the giant increase we've had lately with that. In 2015, the One-Night Council on Unsheltered Homeless People showed an unprecedented 21% increase to 3,772 women, men, and children outside in our city. And I think that is absolutely ridiculous. There's something that should be done, and I would like to see some more encampments and more support for people to where they can improve their own situation. There are a lot of people out there working really hard to get back into society, and I think if you guys could support this, it would help a lot.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Lisa Sawyer, and I'm here on behalf of Real Change. We're here to support the tenant encampment ordinance. As you guys probably know, 95 of my fellow Real Change vendors have signed a letter to support. We also support the amendment to study under residential options. Real Change vendors support the tenant encampments because we know that there ain't enough resources for homeless people. People have turned away from shelters every night. Some of us has been there. A lot of us has been there before.
Some of us are still there.
There are not enough affordable housing in Seattle. There's been people sleeping outside, waiting on the waiting list for years. Tenant encampments is not a permanent solution to ending homelessness, but provides safety and communication for homeless people every night. So please, council members, vote yes on tenant encampments.
My name is John Otto Lillian-Stopey. I testify today on behalf of the Church Council of Greater Seattle, a coalition of Protestant churches throughout the city and King County. Many of our member congregations who have used their property to allow encampments on their property sites and initiating programs of encampment have encountered opposition from the neighbors. But in almost every case, that opposition has melted away once people have learned the nature of encampments, the types of people that are living there, and in fact, these people are like themselves and their neighbors. Members of our congregations and also many of our neighbors, through contact with the people living in neighborhood encampments, have realized that what fears they had were unjustified, and to a large extent, their new neighbors were people like themselves who, for one reason or another, did not have the time, for the time being, the means of paying for regular housing in our community. Through contact with our new neighbors, people came to better understand the economic factors underlying Seattle's homelessness problem. In a good number of cases, these people made, the encampers and the neighbors made mutually beneficial friendships with the encampment people. The Church Council of Greater Seattle therefore urges you, the council members, to pass the amendment that would allow for examination of city-owned residential sites for those sites that would be suitable for encampments. We do so because we are convinced that the placement of encampments in suitable residential areas would serve the best interests of those living in such encampments, as well as the interests of those living in the areas of such encampments. I thank you.
Please read Council Bill 118310.
Agenda item number 3, Council Bill 118310, relating to land use and zoning, amending sections 23.42.054, 23.54.015, 23.76.004, .006, .032, and 23 23.84A.038 of the Seattle Municipal Code and adding new section 23.42.056 to permit transitional encampments for homeless individuals as an interim use on city-owned or private property. The committee recommends the bill pass as amended.
Thank you. Councilmember O'Brien.
Thank you, Council President Burgess. We have a few amendments on this, so my hope was to walk through the base legislation as it came out of committee. I have a small amendment to propose to clarify something that we did in committee, and then we'll tee up amendments about future study and SEPA analysis. So this legislation would create a new permit type for encampments on city-owned, privately owned, or major educational institution-owned property in the city of Seattle. I want to be clear that the current encampments that exist in Seattle under other permits and under other rules, none of that would be affected by the legislation that we're talking about today. These new encampments would require community outreach, including creation of a community advisory committee. They would be subject to certain operational standards that will be developed by Department of Human Services. They could take place on industrial, commercial, downtown, neighborhood commercial, and Seattle mixed zones. The reason of this restriction is in part because of legislation that was, environmental analysis was done on a couple years ago, had studied this land. And so the legislation before us, without going through further environmental review, cannot go beyond the scope of that. That we will address possibly doing further environmental review in a moment. As I mentioned, it could be on city-owned property, private party, or an educational major institution, which specifically addresses University of Washington. The location, we need to have solid access to transit and services. The operator of any such encampment would need to come from a pre-qualification list that will be set up, a roster that will be set up by the Human Service Department. I want to be specific on this because we discussed this at committee too, and I just want to highlight it once again, that the intent is the process for pre-qualifying for operators will allow for both traditional service providers, but also self-managed encampments to be pre-qualified on this process. And finally, one thing that one of the amendments we made in committee was to change this from a one-year permit to allow it to be a permit that could be renewed after 1 year. If the conditions were met according to the Human Service Department. And the intent of committee was that it would be reviewed one time for up to 1 additional year. And so with that, I'd like to move amendment number 1, which just adds some clarifying language to make it explicit that it was a one-time extension. So I will go ahead and move amendment number 1.
Second.
Okay.
Thank you.
As I mentioned, this simply clarifies by inserting the word one time and says, adds a section 4 that says the director may renew a master use permit for a transitional encampment interim use issued according to pursuant to section 23.42.056E for a period not to exceed 1 year, one time, for up to 1 year.
Any questions about the amendment? I think this was discussed this morning at briefing. All in favor of adopting proposed amendment number 1, vote aye.
Aye.
Opposed, vote no. The amendment is adopted.
Great. Now, the next amendment, I'm just going to say some prefacing language, and then I'm going to ask Councilmember Sawant to move her amendment, which would ask the Department of Development to create a study to study all lands in the city. There is also an amendment to that amendment that I believe Councilmember Clark will put forward that would narrow that study to multifamily zones. So we'll walk through those both. I just want to, sometimes when we get in the amendments on amendments, it can be unclear what we're actually doing, and I'm trying to make sure that we all are very clear on what step is. So I will defer to Councilmember Sawant to move her amendment.
I move Amendment 2 to Council Bill 118310.
Second.
Thank you. This amendment was debated in committee. It would ask the Department of Planning and Development to do an environmental impact study into the impacts of allowing all zones to be considered in determining the best locations for the encampments that will be awarded in this new type of permit. The amendment also asks the study to look at the impacts of using land that is owned by other government agencies, such as the Department of Transportation of the state or Sound Transit. In the past, encampments have successfully used such properties. Ideally, encampments are in a location that is mutually agreed upon by the homeless residents of the encampments and the other people in the community that they're going into. We heard really fantastic testimony from Seattle Pacific University students last time about having a positive experience hosting Tent City 3 on their campus, and I think we should attempt to forge these mutual agreements. The main argument against my amendment to include all of these other areas, including all residential areas, has been that residential zones are not close to transit. I find this an absurd idea. If residential zones are not close to transit, then we better urgently re-examine Seattle's bus routes. Not every city property obviously will be a good location for an encampment. So what this resolution does is allow us to study them all rather than pre-deciding or presupposition that homeless people are somehow should only be able to allow here or there. By agreeing to study all zones, the City Council will uphold the principle that we are all residents, whether we have a roof over our heads or not.
Thank you. Proposed amendment number 2 is in front of us. Councilmember Clark, I believe you have an amendment to the amendment.
Yeah, I think we thought we would just put both of these in play at the same time so that we can have a discussion about what the merits of both approaches are. So, first of all, I do want to thank Councilmember O'Brien for shepherding this through committee, and thank Mayor Murray for bringing forward the proposal. And as folks who have been a part of this conversation for a long time know, we've talked about this previously. And I've not been a supporter of this in the past, but certainly the circumstances of where we are as a city, the number of people who have no better option than to be sleeping on our streets has become so much of a greater crisis in our city. The number of people, as was mentioned in testimony, and as many of us who do the one night count have seen, is just demonstrably different from how it has been in past years. And I think a lot of us thought that the height of the problem would come during the recession. The recession, according to The Economist, is long over. Many people have missed the end, are still waiting for it. And for people who are living on our streets, the recession actually maybe wasn't the biggest problem. It was the fundamental shift in the economy. It was the pullback from a lot of state and federal funding of supports and the cumulative effects of several decades of disinvestment in low-income housing and safety net services from the federal and state governments. That leaves cities struggling to figure out how to respond. And encampments, unfortunately, are a necessity at this point. They are not the answer to homelessness, and we should not be judging them as an answer to homelessness. They are about safety, community, and coordinated access to resources for people who need help. They need the safety, they need the community, they need the way to find that time of safety in order to be able to grasp the next thing that will help them find safe, decent housing someplace. So, I know, but you're not going to clap in a moment. It's like you're making a down payment, but that's good. So several speakers referenced the residential question, and that's what my amendment would change the wording in Councilmember Sawant's proposal to be, rather than all zones, to be the multifamily zones, and I will explain why. So just as a reminder, the bill as it is right now would allow encampments in areas where people live. So I want to be careful that we're not mistaking something. It is not that encampments, even under the base legislation, would not be allowed near places where people live. And some people have been a little loose with the language. Some people have testified, well, it should, people live places, encampments should be near where people live. That certainly happens now under some of the more difficult permits that we have to use, and the easy tracks of for instance, the easier tracks of church-hosted encampments that are also in single-family neighborhoods. So, like anything with land use, nothing is black and white with this. There are things under the base legislation that will allow encampments to be near where folks live, and under some of the permits that we have right now, it happens in our city under existing authorities. The question is about the future study. And the future study, a version of a future study is going to pass here. The question is, will it be for all zones, including single family? And I would argue that actually, if we are looking for a logical way to do this, that we would parallel how we permit for shelter. We zone for intensities of use. We zone for what makes sense in terms of uses that are adjacent to each other. And I certainly hear the argument that there is transit throughout the city. I think many people would argue that there are different levels and abilities to access transit throughout different parts of the city. The indoor shelter parallel, under single-family zoning, you can do shelter in a single-family zone, but it's an appealable decision. It's an appealable permit. It's an administrative conditional use permit. In the other multifamily zones, it's allowable outright with the buffer standards and things like that, the development standards that are consistent with the encampment legislation that we're talking about here today. So this amendment originally failed at the committee level. I had questions about, is there something we could do that would parallel how we do zoning for this particular type of intensity of use? The shelter system was the closest one that I thought made sense in terms of how would we hook a new zoning decision to something that we do now that I believe works. So again, this change would be for the review that DPD will carry out and return to council with recommendations later this year to be multifamily rather than all zones. And so single family would be the one that would drop out. And my argument, again, is about intensity of uses. I think access to transit is a real question for many of the residential neighborhoods, and also access to services and nearby resources.
Thank you. I'll second the amendment. And colleagues, this amendment is on the blue sheet that was at our desk here. Any comments on the amendment on the amendment? Councilmember Sawant.
So while this amendment to the amendment, I hope it's helping to keep track of it, would be a step forward from the current language in the bill, I think it falls short in several ways. First, single-family zones are not the only zones left out in this amendment as compared to my amendment. This version of the amendment also leaves out Washington State Department of Transportation properties and sound transit properties that, as I mentioned, have been used successfully by encampments in the past. It also leaves out downtown mixed residential, or DMR, and international district residential, or IDR, zones as well. Secondly, I would remind council members that we are only talking about an impact study. I think if we're doing a study, let's study all zones. It seems possible to me that there could be locations for an encampment in a single-family zone that could have real community support. I have to say, I've been approached by many residents of single-family zones who have said that they support this amendment. And I fail to see the logic of preempting the possibility of having that by just doing a study. I do think, though, that underlying all of this, all of the technical speak is the fundamental point that I, as a council member, want to reiterate that we are all equal residents of this city, whether we have a home or not. And rather than getting bogged down in the technical language, let's have a study that includes all zones and see what's viable. Let the Department of Planning and Development look at that. And lastly, I would say that if council members are concerned about access to transit and social services, then please join with me in advocating for full funding for mass transit by taxing the wealthy and full funding of social services.
Councilmember Licata.
Well, I appreciate Councilmember Clark's interest in improving the current legislation, but I will be supporting the amendment by Councilmember Sawant without the additional amendment. And the reason for that is that, when you think about it, the first self-managed encampment in Seattle that Cher started was at the bottom of Queen Anne. Actually, it's on the current ground that the Gates Foundation is now located. And that organization, Cher, which has managed, basically has worked with residents to self-manage the encampments over a long period of time, has had a very good record of working with residents and residents representing, recognizing the ability to people to self-manage. So in that particular instance, what happened was that the community council that existed in Lower Queen Anne at that time had been working with the residents, and they actually went on record that they should not leave that location, which was recommended by, at that time, Mayor Norm Rice, that they leave, and which the local chamber wanted them to leave. They did leave because they were asked to, and they've always left whenever they've been asked to. But it's interesting to note that the community there recognized that having an encampment in an area that was basically next to a residential area was in fact not a negative thing, but in fact was a positive thing, a way of helping out fellow residents get by in the most dire straits that they were at. So I think that if we were to extrapolate from that past into the future, we'd recognize that I believe that many residents in Seattle recognize that we all have to look out for our fellow human beings in trying to give them a roof over their head and an opportunity to have a decent life.
Thank you. On the amendment on the blue sheet, restricting the study to multifamily zones, all in favor of this amendment, vote aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, vote no.
No.
The amendment is defeated. Now the amendment, proposed amendment number 2 is before us. All those in favor of the amendment, vote aye.
Aye.
Opposed, vote no.
No.
No. The amendment is passed.
I wanted to take this opportunity to thank everyone who fought for this ordinance, the activists in Nicholsville and 10 City 3, the UW Health Equity Circle students, the SPU students, the activists from the Church Council and the faith community, Lehigh, SAFE, Share Real, and Real Change, especially wonderful activists like Lisa and Susan and Anitra. This is another example of how when we fight, we can have an impact. Obviously, encampments are not a solution to the housing crisis in Seattle, as many have stated. They are not a solution to homelessness either. But as long as there is homelessness, anything we can do to make people safer, we have an obligation to do. I do think that it is important to take a step back and consider how far the Seattle City Council has come over the past 2 years. It was stated earlier that council members who opposed it this 2 years ago are supporting it now because homelessness has gone up. This is true. Homelessness has gone up. But I think it's important to remember that for everybody who was homeless 2 years ago, it was a matter of urgency. They did not want to see this happen 2 years later. And so it's important for us to examine how come 2 years ago, when Councilmember Licata brought this same bill to the City Council, it failed by a 4-5 vote. Now it is poised to pass unanimously. What has changed is the political mood of this city following a grassroots campaign in the election campaign in 2013, and the fact that the movement of regular people in Seattle has grown to put increasing pressure on the elected officials. And those of you who have packed the council chambers today are an example of this. And you are the reason that the amendment to counter redlining has passed. As a whole, though, this ordinance is a small step towards what Seattle needs to do to address the epidemic of homelessness and unaffordable housing. We need to fight for rent control to rein in skyrocketing rents. We need a Bertha-sized investment in building thousands and thousands of city-owned, full investment in human services. We need tenant rights. And finally, we need to shift the balance of power away from the big developers and landlords who are driving more and more people out of their homes. But in the meanwhile, I'm happy to vote yes on this ordinance.
So I want to say thank you, Mike O'Brien, for shepherding this, and also to the mayor, to Hayoke Kim, and to others who worked on this last winter. You know, I'm one of those members of the 4-5 vote. That was part of the 4. Working with encampments with many of you in this room is something I've been doing for the last decade. We are making good strides. I think this is a step in the right direction, as everybody has underscored already. Encampments are not the solution to homelessness, but yet it is one item and one thing we can do on the continuum to make people safe. And that's really something that I want to focus on right now, and that is to improve our living conditions for everyone in the city. I live downtown. I want to make sure that this compassionate step is put into play. But I'm also going to ask our Human Services Department and our Department of Planning and Development to create a toolkit so that we can move quickly. Those who might be interested in sponsoring an encampment can do so without months of delay. I also want to work with those in our human services community, our public defenders, our police, and even our courts to promote these alternatives. But we must acknowledge that camping or sleeping on sidewalks is unsafe, both for those who are sleeping on the sidewalk and those people who are there that live and work around them. Everyone downtown and in our neighborhoods deserves to feel safe and to be safe in all of our neighborhoods. And what this means is that our police, our parks, SDOT, the business community, I want us to be adopting clear policies and procedures so that we can offer ways for people to get into those shelters at night. Meaning, if somebody is on the street at night, that we have a van to offer them to move to one of these encampments, to provide them places to go and ways to get there. I'm poised to work with our business community. We have people who have already volunteered to put money forward so we can have that kind of a van with case managers that will be available for people, so we can say, you may not be able to be here, but we have some good, safe places for you. So I'm eager both to pass this today and then to move forward with the next steps. Thanks all of you for coming.
You know, in our discussion with our homelessness, I think it's critically important to say that the face of the homeless has changed within my adult time. The face has changed. It's now a teacher, a single parent, children. You know, I was very pleased to be called an unsung hero earlier today, because when I vote as I do, quite honestly and candidly with all of you, my friends, I don't really care who gets the credit. You're here. I'll give you some credit, but it shouldn't really be about who gets the credit on these kinds of votes, because even the people who you think may oppose you might be homeowners who pay their taxes, and we take that money and spend over $40 million a year on trying to help our most vulnerable population. So I'm very proud to support our most vulnerable groups, but I will tell you that having grown up in this city, I have many people I grew up with that are homeless. Their face has changed, and I think we have a strong council that understands this, and we are proud to take these kinds of votes. And at the end of the day, we are all in this together. So we know we're trying to battle this thing we call homelessness. We have to go back to our very basic roots: one community, one city. We all matter. And so as we study where encampments should and could be, I think it's in that spirit. Let's look at our entire city. Let's see what we are doing for our most vulnerable. And let's not exclude and box other people out of the conversation. It should be an inclusive conversation. And I look forward to continuing my work with all of you in here, hearing the sound of my voice. Very proud to take my vote today. Thank you very much.
Roll on Council Bill 118310 as amended.
Godin.
Aye.
Harrell.
Aye.
Licata.
Aye.
O'Brien.
Aye.
Rasmussen.
Aye.
Sawant.
Aye.
Bagshaw.
Aye.
Clark.
Aye.
President Burgess.
Aye.
9 in favor, none opposed.
The bill passes and the chair will sign.